We certainly welcome everybody that's going to study along with us tonight. John and I are going to be spending the next 30 minutes or so studying from the book of Esther. We will, as has been our custom, to kind of give a little synopsis of that book here in just a moment once we get started. And we're going to go through things a little bit differently. A lot of times we have in the past been, as we've been working on our survey through the Old Testament, of covering a chapter or two in a specific book. We're going to try to just kind of hit practical lessons from the book of Esther. So that may turn in to a little bit of jumping back and forth and throughout the book. And so if you've got a Bible handy, if you're sitting down, I guess, if you're driving or you're watching or listening to this some other way, that may be a challenge. Yeah. But but if you are sitting down and listening and you can have a Bible, certainly it'd be helpful. We'll try to do our best to let you know where we're going to be in the book, but there may be a little bit of jumping around in the book as we talk about some practical lessons from the book of Esther. So, John, you doing okay?
Doing good.
All right, good deal. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock for John, and he can give us a synopsis here about what we got going on in the book of Esther.
All right. Well, the book of Esther is a fascinating one. We were talking just before we got on here that it's longer than it feels or that you sometimes think of it. 10 chapters, a couple of them relatively short, but it's got some depth and breadth to it. But it's a really powerful story about Queen Esther and her uncle Mordecai and their interaction and their role that they're playing in the Medo-Persian Empire. Esther and Mordecai are both Jews. Mordecai is Esther's uncle, although we're told in chapter 2 and verse 7 that he raised her like his own daughter. And so they're uncle, but more like a father to Esther. And we see in the first chapter that the king at this time, Ahasuerus, in this Medo-Persian Empire, is looking for a new queen. He has gotten rid of Queen Vashti and is looking for a new queen. And Mordecai encourages Esther to become a part of that process. And so she hides the fact that she's a Jew. And we're told she's a very beautiful woman and she is selected as the next queen, which puts her in a very powerful position and one of influence in the nation at this time. Mordecai is on the scene many times throughout the book, and he uncovers a plot that puts him on the map right away. A couple of men are trying to kill the king, and he really relays that information through Esther and in essence saves the king's life. And immediately that puts him in a position of honor amongst the king and among the people. And that's going to play a role as the story continues. And then we see a man named Haman come onto the scene. This is a man who's very powerful in his own right and a very prideful man. Mordecai refuses to bow down to him and praise him in the way that Haman wants. And so basically Haman takes it out or attempts to take it out on the entire nation of the Jews. He tricks the king into signing a decree in which all of the Jews could be killed. And then through Mordecai and Esther's work, they are able to relay that message to the king and ultimately save the Jewish nation for in that way. And so it's a very powerful story of a woman in a position of authority, a place where she probably never thought she would find herself. But through the help of Mordecai and others, they have a support system among them. They are able to intercede, help the Jewish people. And then Haman, obviously, we'll talk about a little bit later, he gets what's due him as he ultimately becomes the victim of what his own plot was going to be. So that is a little over a 2-minute synopsis, but a synopsis nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. It is we were talking, it's a very fluid story. Even though there are chapter breaks along the way, actually 10 chapters, as John made mention of, it's a very fluid story from the very beginning to the very end. I mean, it is one that moves and seemingly, even though I know, there are some time lapses in between, it almost seems to be, and the very next day, and the very next day, and the very next day, it kind of flows very smoothly. And as you made mention, there are really 4 main characters. You have the king, you have Haman, you have Esther, and you have Mordecai. And as John and I were talking, as we go through the book here, there are a lot of practical applications and lessons that can be learned stemming from these characters for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we'd go back and forth on a few of these and have some discussion, and we'll get to as many as we can in the half hour that we have. But I'll start with one that I have, since John just gave his synopsis. But certainly Haman is the bad guy of the story, and we'll talk about him, I'm sure, in one of our practical applications. I often make the point that in a lot of ways he may be the baddest of bad guys, minus Satan himself. When it comes to bad guys in the Bible. I mean, he is just rotten in every possible way. And so I'm sure we'll talk about him. But there's also kind of I don't want to start on a negative side, but I will, because it really is at the beginning. The first chapter, a lot of times, is a chapter we miss in the book of Esther, because she really doesn't come into play until chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to understand how she comes into play and why she comes into play. But we're talking about just practical applications. I think there is a lesson to be learned, from this first chapter and from the king. Although he does have some redeeming qualities as the book goes on, he doesn't get off to a great start. In a lot of ways, he is almost the perfect picture of someone who just doesn't seem to have great control of himself. He gets angry very, very quickly. We can make the point alcohol certainly is involved, as the text tells us here in chapter 1. Yeah. But he gets angry very quickly. He makes rash decisions and is apt to make difficult, rash decisions, as he does here in chapter 1. Even in his discussions with Haman, he makes very rash decisions. He doesn't just seem to have great control of himself. His anger is mentioned specifically in chapter 1. And, a passage that came to mind in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 17, as is often the case, a very simple statement: he who is quick-tempered acts foolishly. That's Proverbs 14 to 17. And that's the picture of the king Ahasuerus here in chapter 1. One who is quick-tempered acts foolishly. And I thought right here in the first chapter, what a great lesson, because how many times has each and every one of us, in moments that we are upset or moments that we are angry, is not the best moments to make decisions. And oftentimes we do, and oftentimes they're not very good ones. And that's exactly what happens here in the first chapter.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right. The first chapter is easy to overlook, because you're like, we need to get to the part where Esther comes into play.
Yeah.
But, you could do a fascinating study just looking into, the kind of history of the Medo-Persian Empire and the kings and how they come and go and all of that. But I think that's a really, really impactful point about how the king is handling himself in chapter 1. And really, I think in a lot of ways, what you just described sets the stage for, Esther's fear and coming to intervene to the king, and how Mordecai is going to kind of handle all of that. I mean, all of that is kind of based upon what you just mentioned in regards to the role that the king plays in this first chapter. And so it's really important that we don't overlook that, because of the fact that it really does play a big role in the rest of the book.
Yeah, and it's just certainly one that, certainly stood out to me. And normally we're going to talk, Haman falls into that, place. He doesn't have good control over himself either, in any way. And he is apt to make pretty bad decisions because of that. But I think it's just a good reminder for us that, it's important to have control of yourself. I mean, that's a big lesson for the Christian in the New Testament, is to make sure you've got control of yourself. And one easy way that we often lose control of ourselves is when we lose control of our anger. And if our anger takes over, now we're not in control in any ways. And we're always going to be heading in a direction that God doesn't want us to go in. And so I think that's an interesting lesson right out of the chute, really, with this party that takes place. He gets all mad and upset, and he makes what seemingly is a ridiculous decision. Now, it allows Esther to come on the scene, but the decision just seems ridiculous. And he follows that up in the book with other ridiculous decisions as well. So we'll move on to the next. We'll move on to the next one. You okay over there? Are you back with me? I think John is having technical issues, is what we're
Okay.
having. Okay, you
All right.
back. I hear you fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Having a little bit of a technical issue here, but we'll just press on. How about that?
All right. Why don't you hit one of your lessons you got?
So my favorite verse in this entire book is Esther chapter 4 and verse number 14.
Yeah.
And it was the first one when we talked about kind of doing it this way. It was the first one that jumped off the page to me. It's really the last part of that verse. And this is Mordecai speaking to Esther as he's kind of taking this problem to her and asking her to intervene on behalf of the Jews. And she's hesitant to do so. She's scared, rightfully so, understandably so. And he says there at the end of chapter or verse number 14, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And that phrase and the power behind it and the application to us today, I think is really, really strong. This idea that Mordecai is wanting Esther to see that, yes, there's danger involved in what I'm asking you to do. There's understandably some hesitancy on her part. But Esther, you may be in the situation you're in for this very reason.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we need to kind of take note of that as well and realize that God prepares us in different ways for different things that we're going to encounter in our lives. And, sometimes we come upon an obstacle or something in our life that just seems overwhelming and difficult, that we're afraid of, that maybe we just don't want to deal with. And who knows whether we are put there for this very moment. God has equipped us to handle the things in this life that he needs us to be able to handle. And so this verse really stuck out to me. I even thought about this in the context of everything that we've gone through, as a nation and as individuals with 2020 and all the hardship that it brought our way. And, I just wonder, maybe we were put here for 2020. Maybe we were put in the exact situation that we found ourselves in 2020 because God prepared us to be able to work in his kingdom during a time like that. And I think sometimes that helps me realize that God is so much bigger than I am. He has plans for me that I may not always comprehend. And so these words from Mordecai really stuck out to me.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest pieces of trivia when it comes to the book of Esther is that it is the only book that we have in Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, where God or Lord in some form is not mentioned at all. But yet we often will follow that up with, he's most certainly there. He's there from the very beginning, all the way throughout. We come to a passage like that in chapter 4 and verse 14. It's very providential in the way that it's presented by Mordecai, kind of through the servant that's kind of ping-ponging back and forth, at this time, between Esther and Mordecai. But, the point is there that, perhaps God has put you in this place for this reason at this time. And now you're unique in being able to do something here. And, listen, I'll even draw that out a little bit further. I was thinking about, today as I was reading this again, and the providence of God and God being able to put us in places to do good for him. He really is, his hand is in it from the very beginning. From Esther being in the place that she is. She moves to the top very much like we saw with Daniel in a book that we talked about, or even Joseph after, he did in Potiphar's house, moved up very quickly, and certainly with Pharaoh himself moves up very quickly. And Joseph, makes the point, at the very end of the book of Genesis that, he looks back and he sees that all of the things that had in his life put him in a position to be able to do good for his family, and then ultimately the nation moving forward, to put him in, that God meant for all of these things to happen for good. And you see in chapter 2, Esther moving to the top. Things are going very well for her. And all of that culminated with where she found herself here in Esther chapter 4. But the key component is she's able to recognize it and then able to capitalize upon it. And those
Yep.
two things have to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got to recognize it. And you make a good point. Even in moments that we deem as difficult, we rarely think God has wanted me to be in this tough spot.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
mean, usually the temptation is, I can't believe God has done this to me. It's the
Mhm.
temptation instead of, man, he's put me in a position to do some good. Let's look for that. So
Yeah.
we've got to be able to recognize it. But once we recognize it, we've got to be able to capitalize on it. And you made the point. This was a difficult choice for her from going to the king. She makes mention that there's danger involved with going to the
Mhm.
king, even though she's not been called to do so. But she recognizes it, and then she capitalizes upon it.
Yeah.
You've got to have both of those things, and it's an incredible lesson for us for sure.
I have to think there were probably, the emotional roller coaster that Esther must have gone through. As a Jew, she never would have envisioned herself as queen of this
No.
nation. I mean, she never would have seen herself reaching that position. And then to do so probably brought a great deal of joy and excitement and happiness, I would imagine, at least on some level. And then she finds herself in this situation and she's like, why me? Why am I the one that's going to have to do this? I'm sure she feels unprepared. I'm sure she's scared. She probably is, why me? And this reminder from Mordecai that, hey, think about where you came from and what you've achieved. This isn't just coincidence. Again, God's not mentioned specifically, but you can, this is one of my points, but we can kind of talk about it already. You see him throughout this book.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if Mordecai is calling that to remembrance for Esther. Like, God is at work in your life. You need to take notice of that and recognize that. And I think once she does that, she really unlocks the power that God has given her in the position that he's put her in to help the people.
Yeah, and listen, we can do that. I mean, we can do that. I mean, it just even as simple as looking for God. He is everywhere. So looking for him and being able to find him, no matter the circumstance or situation we find ourselves in, listen, we are equipped for this place. The faith that comes from, understanding that, listen, God is not going to allow me to find myself in a position that I'm not equipped for. I'm equipped for this, whatever it is, fill in the blank. I'm equipped for this. And now, how can I go about God's business in this scenario? And living life that way makes a huge difference on our outlook. You made mention of the past year that we had and all the difficulties. I mean, it's very easy to just focus on those things alone, and it's depression. It's your laziness. It's we can't do anything, so I'm not going to do anything kind of mentality. And that's not the idea. Maybe it is the unique opportunities that 2020 and early 2021 has provided that we need to be focusing in on. But we've got to be looking for those things, and then we've got to be willing to then do something about it.
Well, and since we've already been talking about it,
Yeah.
One of my other points in regards to God not being mentioned in this book specifically, but you see his hand everywhere throughout this story.
Yeah.
And I think there's that's one of those points that impacts me on a daily basis. I may not be studying my Bible in the moment, but I'd be foolish to think that God isn't right there with me, helping me and guiding me. If just because we're not praying to him in the moment, just because we're not in the word at the moment, doesn't mean that God's presence isn't there. And he's working in this world. I firmly believe that. And I'm not talking about necessarily in some of the miraculous ways that some may think, but God's presence is everywhere, and he's preparing us, and he's given us what we need to act and to do in this world, things that if I neglect that fact, I would never do. I would never go outside of my comfort zone on his behalf without that understanding and that belief that he's there and he's prepared me for this moment. And so the fact, it seems weird, but it's almost as if God's name not being mentioned in this story makes his presence and his power even more real. Because you can just see him working through these people. in ways without his name ever even being mentioned. And to me, it just makes the story even more powerful as I think about the role that he plays in it.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you made mention of, chapter 4 and verse 14, in a lot of ways, I think it's Mordecai letting her know that this is a step certainly out of her comfort zone. In her mind, could be even dangerous, but this is a step that you can take because God is there with you. It is, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace.
Yeah.
Here is a step you can take because God is with you. We've talked about Daniel being thrown in the lion's den, on this program. It's a step you can take because God is with you. And so when we have that mentality, those out of our comfort zones, maybe even dangerous places, or places apt for difficulties or trouble or persecution, even, here is a step I can take because God is with me. And in a lot of ways, that's what Mordecai is telling Esther. And then that's what this book showcases in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, I've already done 2 of my points, so I feel like we need to get to one of yours here.
Okay.
Or another one of yours. What do you got?
Yeah. Well, one other, to me, Mordecai becomes a centralized figure in this story. I mean, listen, the book is named Esther. She is certainly a centralized figure, but I think there's an argument that can be made that this book is more about Mordecai than maybe even about Esther. I thought about it when I was reading through the book today. His name is mentioned lots of times. And so I did a quick, I didn't have to go through and count per the computer anymore. You can just type it in and find out. But he's mentioned by name 58 times in this book.
Wow.
And just 10 chapters, and a couple of them little. And I thought, man, that is remarkable to think about. But, he is a remarkable figure in this story. And there's a lot of directions certainly that we can go. His love and care for Esther is from the very beginning to the very end, for sure. What we've talked about, the way that he encouraged her to do something good. He does it in a very loving way. But I think what really sticks out to me when you study through this book and you kind of look at Mordecai and the way he conducts himself is the conviction that he has stands out. And certainly courage is what, kind of stuck to me at first. But I think it's his conviction that allows him to be courageous. I mean, he takes stands of not bowing to Haman per se, in the way that he deals with himself there. When the people have that decree written against them and they're all to be annihilated, the way he handles himself with the fasting and the mourning that he does, it's out there in public. People took notice of it. That's how Esther finds out. Somebody saw him and goes to her and says, "What, your uncle? What's he doing?" And to me, you only do that with deep conviction in God and faith in God. And because of that, now he's allowed to exhibit incredible courage, for sure, but it is the conviction that he has, which led to the love that he has, the care that he has for Esther, willing to help. I mean, all of those are great lessons and attributes, but, certainly I think, in the half hour we have to spend a couple of minutes talking about Mordecai, who really is an important figure in this story, is certainly there.
Yeah, and that word conviction is so important in the life of a Christian, because without that, we're never going to be effective in talking with others about the gospel. We're certainly not going to be effective teachers, preachers. We have to be convicted within ourselves first if we ever want to be effective at talking with others. And I think that showcases in Mordecai. He is convicted that this is what needs to happen. Esther, you need to go intervene on behalf of the king. Everything's going to work out. He was absolutely convicted that this is what needs to happen. And so because of that, he was persuasive and he was convincing. But without that conviction, I don't think Esther would have done what she did. And so that was an important part of his role in the story. And then, you think about our lives today and how we are to be the mouthpiece for God in this world. If we aren't convicted of the truth, if we aren't convicted of sin and the consequences that it can bring, we're not going to change anybody's mind. We're not going to lead them anywhere. What if I try and tell somebody, hey, come read the Bible with me, and I want to introduce you to Jesus and tell you about what he's done for me in my life. but I don't believe, I'm not convicted that he's actually done anything and changed me in any way, they're going to see through that in a heartbeat.
Right.
And I'm not going to be effective at all. I may say all the right words, but I'm not going to be effective if I'm not convicted. And so that word is just so crucial to us as Christians today if we want to be impactful in this world.
And then the powerful, influence that one convicted person can have.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, it's just he's one guy, and then the impact of one guy being convicted and doing the right thing, it can be seen not just on Esther, but ultimately on the saving of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly Esther was the one that went into the king and set up those two feasts to kind of get Haman out into the light. But it was Mordecai that encouraged her to do that. And, without him, would she have made this choice? I mean, we don't know, because she was there or because he was there. And that, for us to say, listen, if I live the kind of life that God wants me to live, and I'm convicted to him in every way, the impact that it can have on the people around me is profound. And I think it's impossible to even overestimate even the power that can be found in one convicted person. We've seen it in the story of Daniel that we've talked about. We've made mention of Joseph already, and the conviction of that one person, and what we see unraveled in the rest of the Old Testament because of the decisions that one man made. And that certainly can be us because of the power that God has behind us.
Well, this is really a good lead in to my last one. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and bring this up because I think it goes hand in hand with what we're talking about here. One of the things that I saw as I was reading through this was a process that must exist in order for us to act boldly on God's behalf. And you read through here, and you've mentioned already the fasting that the people were doing, and you see the wise counsel of Mordecai for Esther, and you see her internally trying to figure out, how is this going to work? Is this the right thing for me to do? But once she goes through those processes, then she acts boldly. And I think I was thinking about that. I was, how often, even in my own life, have I prayed about something? Have I asked for the advice of someone who is older, wiser, more mature than me? Thought about it, meditated upon it, and then just not done anything. And all of that time, the time spent in prayer and the time talking to other people and the time thinking about it and chewing on it, if I don't then trust that process and act on it, that was all for naught. And I think what I need to do a better job of myself is to realize, if I've prayed to God about this and I've sought wise counsel about this and I've taken my time to make a decision, then I need to have the confidence to act on that, knowing that I have done. Now, that doesn't mean I'm always going to make the right decisions, but I've gone through the right process to make a wise and informed decision. And that's what we see Esther doing here. And I think if I do a better job of implementing those processes in my own life, I think I'm going to do a better job of acting boldly when I need to. And I'm going to have more confidence in the decisions that I make if I trust the process. And I think that's one of the things that I saw here with Esther. She, as difficult as it was, she trusted the process. And so she was able to act boldly with confidence there.
It's an interesting point that in a lot of ways we see throughout Scripture. I mean, we even see both sides of it. I mean, how often through Scripture are we reminded of when someone is going to make a decision and misses key components of that important process, whether it's a lot of times it'll be seeking God's counsel. We skip that part, and now a devastating decision is made. Well, we're reminded of that so often because of how important it is for each and every one of us, that there is a process that we need to go through, especially when making a big decision or we have something that we're dealing with in our life. To talk to God, seek wise counsel from him and even from others, and the importance of meditating and the importance of focusing, on what you have at hand, slowing down even at times, with the opposite of what we see in Esther chapter 1. As we made mention already, a king who was rash in his decisions. He wasn't interested in any process whatsoever.
Right.
And so here we see the opposite of that. And it is a powerful reminder, to the importance of that. And we see it playing out even with Jesus at times. Of even him trusting that process, and certainly a powerful, thing for us to consider as well.
Well, that contrast is so stark in the garden when Jesus spends the night praying and Peter spends the night sleeping. And then the way they react so differently that next morning to the guards coming to take Jesus. Peter didn't go through that process. He didn't spend the time in prayer, and so he acted rashly and erratically. Jesus acted calmly and boldly. And you can see one trusted the process to make that decision. The other didn't go through the process, and they made a poor decision. And so I think there's, like you said, there are several places where you go in Scripture where that contrast is brought out.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Well, we're at the end of our half hour. I'm going to throw in one 30-second freebie here at the end. It would be remiss of us not to make mention of Haman in any way. As centralized as Esther and Mordecai are, Haman is, certainly to the story. And we made mention of him already. He's not a great person to emulate in any way. And I think his biggest downfall, there's no question, is pride. I mean, it is his pride that ate him up from the very beginning. And it's his pride that ultimately even becomes his downfall. When he's invited to the feast, by Esther, all he could think about is, hey, I'm eating with the king and queen and nobody else is. And he was blinded by everything else happening around him. And that's what pride does, is it just blinds us to the realities of what's happening around us. And it'll ultimately destroy us. And that's what's happened, to him. One interesting thing that I thought about, that passage in Proverbs chapter 6, 16 through 19, of those things that God hates. He'll showcase all of those in this book. And, one is bad enough, but if you're going to hit all of those, that's usually not going to be a good ending for you. But listen, here's a segue. It's going to be the ending for us.
It is.
So we appreciate everybody studying along with us here in the book of Esther. I certainly enjoyed it. If you have, some time, I'd open it up. I read it today from chapter 1 through chapter 10. It was a much faster read than you think. It didn't take me all that long. A very smooth read from the beginning to the end. And I certainly would encourage that, to find some time this week and to do that. So we appreciate everyone studying along with us. John, you got anything else?
Nope. We'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thank you so much.